Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. Mars makes it as easy as possible for you to get your pharmaceutical, medtech, or digital health product to the market and, of course, get the price it deserves. My name is Stefan Walzer. I'm the founder of Mars and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics already since 2004. Additionally, I have founded the consultancy P&N Pricing and Negotiations in Healthcare based in Toronto, Canada, which supports companies and individuals globally by coaching, simulations, and training, especially on negotiations. This service is including our innovative virtual reality simulation program and is part of the Negotiation Lab. And now let's learn about the market access and reimbursement systems around the globe. So welcome, Jamie. Thanks a lot for accepting also the opportunity speaking to you here on the podcast on market access. Today, a bit more broader. I think today the market access terminology we're using here is including the regulatory world. But before maybe jumping to the details and to the content, I think it would be great if you could very quickly introduce yourself.
Sure. Well, thank you, Stefan, for having me on this podcast. It's always fun to reconnect with former colleagues. So I'm Jamie Cross. I'm Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at a San Francisco-based cancer immunotherapy startup company. We're about 60 employees. And I've been in the industry, about 20 years, I'd say, working primarily in regulatory affairs, but I've also worked in drug safety. But I started my career at the Food and Drug Administration in Washington, D.C. So I've seen both the regulator side as well as the regulated side of biotech and pharma.
Perfect. Yeah, and I think that's also why we both thought that I think this discussion could be really valuable, I think, for, let's say, any kind of aspect of market access. But I think maybe one step after the other, and you mentioned already, let's say, the FDA and the focus probably today also a bit more on the US. Could you quickly introduce and explain people, maybe not that familiar as well with the FDA work and the responsibility, how especially industry could go and get into cooperation, probably more a collaboration with the FDA? What is really needed there?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question because if you decide to formally submit an application to run a clinical trial or seek marketing authorization with the FDA, it's quite a bit of work, and there are a few ingredients or a few steps to get started. The first is to identify a U.S. agent who can act on behalf of a foreign client. So the FDA requires a local representative based in the U.S. That's quite familiar with, quite similar to other countries. And so it's important to take the time to find a reputable regulatory consulting group to represent your company should you be located outside of the United States. The second thing is also to perhaps in consultation with a local representative to ensure you understand what part of the FDA has jurisdiction of your product. So is your product an in vitro diagnostic? Is it a gene therapy, a small molecule, a biologic? Could it be a combination of things? And this is important because these different product classes are regulated by different parts of the agency. Just as, for instance, the EMA has a CHMP for human medicines, a veterinary committee for veterinary medicines, and so on, you wouldn't want to direct your attention and effort to the wrong part of the agency. And then the third thing is maybe from a practical standpoint, if you're wanting to start communication with the FDA, which is overwhelmingly done by email, you need to have an application number assigned, which in essence serves as a reference number. So typically the first step before you do anything with the FDA is to establish what they call a pre-IND number. if you wanted to meet with the FDA before you actually undertake clinical testing in the US, you would need this. And the FDA website has more information on how to go about establishing a pre-IND number. And then, of course, after, you can ultimately submit an IND. And an IND, for those who don't know, is an investigational new drug application. It's somewhat similar to a CTA application ex-US. The difference is with an IND, you can have multiple clinical trials under a single application number, as opposed to having an individual CTA number for each individual trial you do. So in a way, it streamlines things a bit. And the last thing I was just going to say on sort of the practicalities of getting set up with the FDA is that, unlike the CTA application process in Europe, the IND application itself is quite extensive. It's not uncommon for an IND application to exceed 5,000 pages. And if you had a compound with quite complex manufacturing and complex clinical protocol, such as a cell or gene therapy, your application could be 10,000 pages. So it's really important to have that agreement with the agency ahead of filing an application, what their expectations are in terms of content and key features of the study design and so on. Otherwise you could be preparing quite a bit of work just to get the application in with perhaps a result you're not seeking. So having that conversation is important. And then I would say, because it's a complex application, there's a lot of thought that needs to be put into the planning. I mean, it's not uncommon for it to take six months to pull together an application just to start clinical testing. And while I know your audience is probably more focused on market access and more interested in NDAs and BLAs, you can imagine that for marketing authorization, that application gets only more complex. And so in my experience, you start planning for submitting a marketing application 1.5 to 2 years in advance of the submission date.
Gotcha. I mean, I think you mentioned already quite a lot of, let's say, complexities, especially maybe for people who are not that familiar with it. You also mentioned that, the let's say, putting an application together could easily, let's say, take up to 6 months. I mean, when would you recommend to start at least the internal planning, including maybe the first kind of contact with the FDA, meaning, just to get to know, obviously, what to put together and also in which ways, right?
Yeah. I mean, some of this depends on what level of internal expertise your organization has. In my most recent experience, I initiated sort of formal contact with the agency about 1.5 years prior to starting a first-in-human study for a compound. And so at the time we had that contact, we already had either initiated or completed the non-clinical testing that was required to successfully submit an IND application to start human testing. So what I mean by that is I decided that it was important to meet with the FDA about 1.5 years ahead of clinical testing. But perhaps 1.5 years before that, we were already running animal studies to support that clinical testing. So the time horizon can be quite long. Obviously, for instance, if you worked in a company where you licensed in an asset that has already been in the clinic and had previously been filed under an IND with the FDA, it may just be a matter of requesting a new IND number and submitting a new protocol. And there aren't a lot of questions about the risks of the product and the manufacturing. So every situation will be, of course, quite unique, but I would err on the side of caution and plan years in advance.
So maybe moving a bit further. I mean, as you said, I think most of our listeners are probably especially interested around the commercialization, the approval by the FDA, etc. So we had, let's say, the start of that whole endeavor in a way. So obviously everybody's very interested in the drivers for such a successful regulatory process down to the approval in the US. Anything what you can share out of your experience?
Yeah, we already talked about planning. So planning is critical. That's why most companies have a regulatory department to think ahead about what hoops you have to jump through along the way. And so I often think that the planning just pays off at the end, making sure you have all your ducks in a row, so to speak. And ensuring you have the right resources, experienced staff and consultants, and so on. I'd say the other thing to consider is taking the time to anticipate what are the questions regulators are going to ask. Perhaps this is similar on the market access side. You want to think in advance of having an interaction with payer organizations about what are the sorts of things they're going to ask for, and just building that into your work plan. On the regulatory side, we typically, without even thinking about it, we know we're going to get questions about, did you select the right patient population for your registrational study? Ensuring there's agreement on the right endpoints, how much safety data that you will need on your patients. So all those are important and part of the planning process, and your development strategy. The next thing I think that is absolutely critical is building trust. Does your company have a reputation for cutting corners or submitting sloppy documents that require a lot of attention within the agency to sort information out because it's not well organized or not well thought through? Do they have confidence that you're putting patients first in, when they look at your clinical trial design? Do you have the right risk measures in place, patient monitoring, and so on? And so, all that is to say trust is really important, because it's very hard for the FDA or really any agency to help your organization if they don't feel like they can get on board with what you're trying to accomplish. And do they develop that sense of hesitation either through, issues of quality or thoughtfulness in the strategy and so on. So it really speaks to the importance of cultivating a relationship with the agency. And, with that in mind, it's important when you're trying to build that or cultivate that relationship to anticipate where the agency, like what the agency is thinking about. So I talked about, asking the right questions of your team, like do we have the right endpoints, the right safety, are we collecting the right safety data? So the way you do that is by putting yourself in the mind of the reviewer going through your application or your dossier, and start asking those questions. And one of the things that I think is really fundamental to being able to do that successfully is to understand that the FDA and a lot of agencies think about the end first. So we often talk about, the FDA can be very label driven. They're trying to understand how is the design of this trial leading to the design of the next trial, leading to the design of the registrational trial, and how will that then support claims you want to make in the label or the package insert. And so even in very early stages, such as the submission of a first-in-human study, it is quite typical to get feedback from the FDA saying, okay, when this study is completed, we want you to come back and talk to us about X, Y, and Z topics ahead of initiating a registrational trial. And so they're already connecting the dots of how A will lead to B to C and so on. And so I think it's really important for sponsors or companies to be very mindful of where you want to be with a commercial product launch years down the road, even at the time you're submitting a first-in-human study. And so for instance, right now, some hot topics at the agency are dose optimization in oncology. I spend my days, thinking about oncology drug development. And so even at IND clearance for a first-in-human study, they will come back to you with written feedback saying, please come and speak to us to discuss dose selection and how to optimally identify the proper dose to take into studies to support commercialization of your product. And so you have to think as a sponsor, how am I going to address those questions that they're going to have for us several years from now? What do I need to do right now? So it's an enormous amount of planning and alignment with the agency by just getting into the mindset of those reviewers. And I think that's what makes a good regulatory strategist and a good strategist from really any product development function is thinking strategically and thinking ahead.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks a lot for those insights. I mean, we have focused quite a bit on the FDA, and I mean, as you know, we have especially, let's say, on the payer side, quite complexities also, but not only in Europe. So not thinking yet about the payers, but are there any kind of key differences between the EMA in Europe and the US FDA as you have just described? Or is it basically the same thing, but just in different, let's say, maybe jurisdictions and legal frames?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I will caveat for your audience that I am not the world expert on European regulatory affairs. There are many more individuals who are more qualified than I, but I have had some interactions and certainly even just in the product development process, done quite a bit of ex-US regulatory activities. And I think one of the key differences between EMA and the US FDA relates to, for instance, the oversight of clinical development versus marketing authorization. So FDA manages both the INDs under which you file your individual clinical protocols, and they also oversee review of marketing authorizations or applications such as NDAs and BLAs. On the other hand, as your audience probably knows well, with the EMA and CHMP, they handle the review of the MAA, but the individual countries or member states handle the CTAs. So I think in a way it means the regulatory oversight in the US is a bit more streamlined because the same therapeutic review division, sometimes even the individuals on the review team that assess your IND application for your first in human study could in fact be the same one that reviews your licensing application many years later. That's not always the case. Sometimes you pivot into a new indication or therapeutic area with your compound, and obviously the oversight and review can change. But by and large, for instance, if you're developing a drug for hematologic malignancy, it will be that first in human study will be reviewed by the same division that would review your marketing application, and that is quite a powerful or unique feature of the FDA, because it allows you to cultivate those relationships that I was talking about earlier and get to know the sort of the philosophy in regulatory review that some of the team members at the FDA might have, or the philosophy of the division and what some of their concerns are. And I don't know if that necessarily translates on with the competent authorities in different member states within the EU versus the EMA and the rapporteurs that are assigned to review the MAA when it's submitted. So to me, it seems like there's a little bit of a disconnect, and also, do you go for national scientific advice in Europe versus get centralized advice from CHMP? These sort of differences can create regulatory uncertainty in and of themselves, and I think that's a very striking difference between regulatory agencies like the FDA in the US versus the EMA in Europe. On a more technical level, the review process is quite different between the EMA and the FDA. When you submit a marketing application in the US, the FDA wants all of the source data, all of the non-clinical research reports in mice, monkeys, in vitro, et cetera. And with data formatted to a certain specification, they want a similar level of detail in the manufacturing to support their inspections. And which even if facilities are located ex-US, they can still go and do a manufacturing inspection. And they want to receive all the clinical study reports for every study done. They want data sets to be provided in a specific format and programmed a certain way. And so this to me is quite striking. It requires an enormous amount of work, but they don't rely just on summary documents that pull together all of the source data. They actually drill down into the source data itself. And one of the things, if I can just elaborate for a second, that also makes the FDA unique is they have, sort of an army of statisticians. And so when they ask for the code by which source data was programmed for your pivotal trials, they will reanalyze the source data according to their specifications. They don't ask the sponsor to go redo an analysis. I mean, they might, but they will also rerun the analyses themselves. And that's quite unusual compared to most regulatory agencies. So just those are a couple of things. And another key difference is the reviewers in each agency and who they represent. This maybe touches a little bit on what I said, but when members of the CHMP, specifically the rapporteur and co-rapporteur, are assigned as scientific reviewers, they're assigned from a member country. They're not from the EMA itself. So those individuals review the application through their perspective, which may be shaped by cultural, medical, societal issues in the country they come from, whether it's Spain, Hungary, Sweden, and so on. With the FDA, this is obviously quite different. Their reviewers are all American, and the healthcare policies and issues might be considered more uniform, even if there are nonetheless substantial inequities within the U.S. But in my view, the culture within the FDA tends to differ between the review divisions, and these may be shaped by both, the leadership of those divisions, as well as sort of the pressing issues within specific therapeutic areas that those divisions represent. So, some might say one FDA division or therapeutic division or therapeutic area is more open or closed towards a new scientific concept, maybe a new endpoint, let's say, whereas another might be more conservative, or one may want more safety data typically than another, and that might be an artifact of the therapeutic area they represent. But at the end of the day, what I'm getting at is I think where you see differences within the FDA and the review process might be shaped more by therapeutic area, and that's probably true also within EMA. But I also wonder to what extent the fact that rapporteurs and co-rapporteurs come from different member states, how that actually shapes the review process. And the last thing I was going to say on this is that there are also policy differences, and maybe we can get into that a bit more later. And also, what are different trends and areas of focus? For instance, in oncology, FDA has historically been quite open to accelerated approval based on a surrogate endpoint reasonably likely to predict clinical benefits, such as survival, in a cancer patient population with relapsed or refractory disease. Whereas EMA still favors a pivotal trial that uses a clinical endpoint instead of a surrogate, and prefers randomized controlled data versus single arm data. And so the conditional approval process at EMA, while it exists, has not been as popular, at least in the oncology space, from what I can tell. And I know some of this has to do also with payer considerations, pricing and reimbursement of drugs that go through the conditional approval process. So maybe this is something we can untangle a bit more. But the payer environment in the US and the EU are quite different. And so payer pressures on the FDA have been less tangible, if I could be so bold as to say, compared to payer pressure on the EMA. And so I think that might be one thing that contributes to differences between EMA and FDA. Going back to your original question about where I see some differences between the two agencies.
Yeah, thanks a lot for those insights as well. And I mean, you're touching base already on a couple of, I think, also an additional kind of important point. I think you just mentioned the payer side, and submissions obviously always also there, right? So you need to have the approval in order to, let's say, commercialize, but then finally need to find, let's say, as well the payers in general, who would then obviously need to pay for the drugs or the medical devices, etc. I mean, you have worked basically on both sides, as you have as well alluded to in your introduction. Is the payer world not just, let's say, very similar? They're just adding cost there, but at the end of the day, it's more or less the same thing as the regulatory bodies are doing. Maybe even a bit of, let's say, less kind of impact because they are only, let's say, looking on the normally randomized controlled trials, or at least the pivotal trials. So is that not more or less the same? They're just wanting to see the data and then just want to discuss and negotiate the prices?
Yeah, so I know what you're getting at, and I would say no. As you know, in sort of the field of economics at large, you typically have to define the perspective when talking about decision making, and regulators and payers represent very different perspectives. And so how a regulatory health authority such as EMA or FDA defines quote unquote value is different because they're a regulator, and that's different from a payer. So I appreciate that the idea that maybe the payer world is just adding costs but not doing a whole lot more on top of what the regulatory bodies are doing. But just by virtue of having a different perspective and how they're tackling issues itself makes them different, and what they're trying to answer different from a health authority. EMA and FDA are focused primarily on the therapeutic or clinical value of a technology at the time that licensing application is submitted. And asking questions like, do the benefits outweigh the risks? Are there sufficient underlying data? Is that data of high quality? And yes, payers may be asking some of these very same questions, but in a way, it's still nonetheless different because they may be asking a question, but for a different reason. So for a new gene therapy to treat an ultra rare disease, a health authority like the EMA or FDA would be focusing their assessment on the clinical benefits and risks, the manufacturing, the data integrity. The payer is placing that therapeutic benefit risk assessment into a larger context of whether society or the payer can afford it, what's the budget impact, how do we maximize the value of the technology through efficient access schemes, and so on. I think a great example of that is when these very effective drugs to treat chronic hepatitis C were licensed by regulators about a decade or so ago. They were extremely effective at eradicating the virus and really curing patients, essentially. But with the prevalence of the disease, there was a real question about whether payers could afford to reimburse these medications because of the high financial cost to society, given the high cost of the treatment. And so the payers were necessary to untangle a whole host of questions after agencies like FDA and EMA determined that, yes, indeed, there is enormous therapeutic value due to the positive benefit risk. So there is just one example of the difference between the two types of agencies. And then I think we need to not forget the role of regulators in reviewing and approving generic and biosimilar products. That's another topic, an important one, and maybe could be the topic of an entire podcast episode. But I mention this because here's an entire class of compounds where the regulatory review is focused less on benefit risk and more on product quality and exposure, such as PK/PD. And yet that pathway is critical, that regulatory pathway is critical to ensuring that the coverage period for high cost innovators lasts only as long as they have exclusivity. So maybe I can rephrase this another way. Without this regulatory pathway created for biosimilars and generics by health authorities, the benefit that payers stand to gain from having access to lower cost products wouldn't be there. And yet the availability of this entire class of drugs is because the FDA is more, and other agencies are more focused not on clinical risk benefit, but more on bioequivalence and assessing PK/PD and manufacturing. And so depending even on the product class, there can be a disparity between the regulatory agency and the payer agency that further distinguishes their role in the overall process of getting medicines to patients. And then just to maybe elaborate on your question a bit more, because I sensed in your question some concern about the efficiency with which these two types of agencies work together, whether it be in the US or Europe. And I think it's quite a large topic for discussion. In the US, you have a single regulatory authority, the FDA, for a single country of 330 million people, but a highly fractured payer environment due to healthcare privatization, except for the elderly, and we can talk more about Medicare. In the EU, you have a market representing over 400 million people, and yet you are challenged with having these many member states, each with a different payer model from the next. And so I think to get to your question about the role of the payer versus the regulator and redundancy, it is shaped in part by just the framework. You know, do you have one country, one regulator, one payer? Do you have one region made up of 20 plus countries, almost 30 countries, and each with their own payer, but a single product regulator? This then sort of further complicates the question. But you could say it does create quite a bit of job security for health economists to sort out.
That is true.
And, in the end, there's a level of interdependency here between regulators and payers, such that the payers are not essentially doing the same thing, but they really are reliant on regulators for working with sponsors or companies to generate the right evidence to first achieve regulatory approval, but then hopefully have the right evidence as well to make pricing and reimbursement decisions. So this notion of evidence generation, as well as sort of risk-benefit assessment, end up being pretty hot topics, and maybe something we want to circle back to.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you mentioned already, let's say I think also the difference, but also the, let's say, intercorrelation in a way between the payers and also sometimes the regulators. I mean, I have heard, and I'm not an expert in the US, but I have heard about the certain kind of relationships between Medicare and FDA. Could you also allude a bit on that one? What is behind that?
Yeah, so I actually think this is very much related to what I was just talking about in response to your last question, which is it's a relationship built around evidence generation. So the FDA needs evidence to make a benefit risk assessment or risk benefit assessment. These terms flip flop. Whereas Center for Medicare needs evidence to make a coverage or reimbursement decision. And that's probably familiar to folks, wherever they are. There's a regulator and a payer, and they look at evidence a little bit differently. Procedurally, they have a memorandum of understanding between FDA and Medicare to be able to share information and resources if needed to promote public health, which is what their mission is. And they are each headed by appointees of the President of the United States, and each agency covers a wide range of technologies, not only pharma and biotech, but diagnostics and medical equipment. And FDA's jurisdiction actually goes even further into veterinary medicine, cosmetics, food, and so on. But historically speaking, going back to evidence generation, historically speaking, the evidence by which Medicare makes coverage determinations has been based largely on the evidence that FDA reviews to make a licensing decision of a new technology in the first place. So the evidence, whether it's a randomized or single-arm study, a placebo or active-controlled study, and so on, is negotiated during the product life cycle between the sponsor and the FDA. And interestingly, Medicare isn't a participant in those discussions, despite having to make a national coverage decision after FDA approval on those data, and not just a coverage decision, but doing an assessment and so on that leads to a coverage decision. And so where sometimes there can be a bit of a strain is when Medicare realizes that the evidence to support regulatory approval by the FDA is maybe insufficient to reimburse a technology for the Medicare eligible population. And so that's where sometimes you see a bit of news coverage. For instance, the new product's approved by the FDA, but there's question about whether it will be reimbursed under Medicare for the elderly population in the U.S. And just to sort of get at a little bit into the history behind this. So in 2006, Medicare issued a coverage with evidence development pathway. It was subsequently revised in 2014. But what this did was establish a pathway where technologies with insufficiently persuasive evidence to justify coverage nationally for the Medicare population, which maybe your listeners know is individuals over the age of 65 in the United States. But it created a pathway whereby patients could be covered provided they participated in a clinical trial or in a registry with the goal of generating more robust data, outcomes data, for example, on safety and efficacy. And this pathway has not been used for a lot of products. It's quite a short list, but there are some examples like cochlear implants for hearing, allogeneic stem cell therapies, and others. And if you fast forward from 2006 to today, so another 17 years, if my math is correct, we're having similar conversations about the role of, for instance, real world evidence, evidence generated from digital health technologies, and the list goes on. And the common denominator, is that they all relate to evidence generation. The relationship between the FDA and CMS, in my mind, is really defined in large part by the differences in how they use evidence, whether the evidence is sufficient for the decision they need to make, i.e. to support their perspective on the decision they need to take. And even though they are indeed both federal health agencies to serve and promote public health, the issue of evidence generation is really one that I think distinguishes the two agencies. And as you and I were talking just before the podcast started, there has been a lot of news and press lately about the recent history of biologic therapies for Alzheimer's disease. And this year, we saw the FDA take an accelerated approval decision for a monoclonal antibody based on the surrogate endpoint of amyloid plaque reduction in the brain. But Medicare only provided coverage for those patients who were enrolled in a registry or clinical trial that was designed to the standards outlined by CMS. And national coverage for the Medicare population was deferred until full approval on the clinical endpoints such as cognition, and that full approval needed to be a randomized controlled trial so that the risk-benefit profile of the new therapy was firmly established. And in I think just the past few days, that full approval has occurred, and Medicare has announced that they would provide full coverage for the Alzheimer's biologic therapy. So this is, I think, a very timely example of how evidence generation between FDA and the sponsor then leads to certain decisions taken by Medicare, whether it's a condition, sort of a conditional or coverage with evidence type of reimbursement decision, or a full reimbursement decision because the sponsor has now obtained a full approval from the FDA.
Very good, very good. So, I mean, the time is running, so I would maybe just go probably to our last question. And I mean, you have a lot of experience, as you have as well, just let's say told us as well in the last couple of minutes, especially in the US. So maybe we want to focus here a bit on on the US FDA and maybe the future. Where would you, or do you think you would see the FDA in 10 years from now?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all health authorities are at the margin dealing with different issues. And what I would say is for the FDA, I think the appropriateness of single arm studies for oncology accelerated approval is something that has been a hot topic this year specifically, and I think it'll take a few years to sort out. And that, as I said, I'm talking specifically about oncology. That's where I spend my time primarily. It will take some time to tease out what is the right registrational path to secure FDA approval in the US for an oncology therapeutic. And on top of that, and maybe looking more long-term, 5-10 years down the road, I think it's technological innovation that, in my mind, is what takes any regulatory agency, including the FDA, down a certain path where they and determines where they'll end up in 10 years. So the role of artificial intelligence in product development and perhaps even in technology assessment is something that is still being defined as we speak. And so I think that the FDA will need to devote a lot of time to understanding not just the potential utility of artificial intelligence for product development, but possibly even regulation, and also to think about the misuse of artificial intelligence and how to avoid that. And so defining some guardrails that prevent the misuse of that technology. I think digital health technologies is something that has been an ongoing area of interest for regulators like the FDA. And I think even 5-10 years from now, we will still be trying to optimize how to better integrate such technologies into product development, and what level of regulatory oversight is required. So, remote data collection, for instance, do patients have to come into a clinical trial site to capture information, or can that be done through digital health technologies, wearable devices, that sort of thing? This has been, as you know, something that's been discussed for a number of years, but it still feels like there's an enormous amount of burden to patients when they participate in clinical trials, because so much has to be done in person even today. So at the end of the day, I think where FDA and other agencies will land a decade from now will be determined by the innovation and technologies. And I don't know where all that innovation will occur. Maybe it's for new disease areas, or, as I said, digital health technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of outlook, and I think it corresponds to what we see across the industry. I think especially obviously on the focus on digital health in a very broad sense. So thanks a lot, Jamie. It was really great to listen to you. I think a lot of great insights, especially in the combination between regulatory and the payer side, and I'm sure this will not be the last episode together, because I think there are a lot of more things we could, let's say, jointly discuss. Thanks a lot for your insight, Jamie.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan. It's been a real pleasure, and always enjoy discussing these topics with you. Take care.
That was an episode of MAP, the market access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.